Good evening. I'm Henry Olson, Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, the co-host along with our friends at the American Enterprise Institute of this debate tonight. And I would like to thank all of you for coming both in person, and to those of you who are watching us online, thank you for making the time for this. This is the first debate in a series of debates that EPPC is going to be hosting here in Washington over the next few weeks. We call it the Crossroads of Conservatism series because we believe, guess what, that conservatism is at a crossroads. Why is that? Well, we've been seeing in the Trump era an ongoing debate about what conservatism means, that for many decades it seemed to have settled into an orthodoxy that the Republican Party was happy with, its voters were happy with, but we now know that has been unsettled. And we've been undergoing a increasingly intense and serious debate here in Washington over what does conservative principles imply today, what are those principles, and the trifecta that the Republicans gained in the recent election brings that into sharp focus. Because for the first time in a few years, the Republicans, and by inference, conservative movement, has the power to enact sweeping legislation. It has also achieved that new power on the basis of a new political coalition, one that is dramatically different from the one that was attracted to the Republican Party circa 1992 through 2016 or even 2020. And it was obtained in part by the leader of that coalition, President-elect Trump, campaigning explicitly on a number of non-orthodox policy ideas. So this series is meant to bring this debate out into the open, both for people here in DC, but more importantly for people around the country, to see how conservatives come at similar topics from different perspectives, but yet can still be conservative and have that conversation civilly. We'll be having 4 other debates. You can read which ones they are by Googling Crossroads of Conservatism. You can sign up for that on the EPPC website. We have a separate description for each event. The next one is going to be on industrial policy this Thursday at the Kimpton George. Those of you present can sign up and attend in person. Those of you online who are in DC can do so, and those of you who are online and not in DC can sign up to watch that debate as well. Well, today we are going to have 2 able and intelligent proponents of different views on our topic, which is officially resolve. Public policy in recent decades has caused economic changes that have worsened the quality of life for most Americans. We are structuring this as a debate, not a discussion. There will, of course, be discussion, but one person is going to take the affirmative and say, yes, it has, and one person is going to take the negative and say, no, it has not. Arguing the affirmative is Oren Cass. He is the founder and the chief economist of American Compass. And arguing the negative is Scott Winship, a senior fellow and director of the Center for Opportunity, or Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility here at AEI. We will be taking questions either online. Those of you online can see how to do that by emailing abigail.wallen, W-A-L-L-E-N, at aei.org, or on Twitter with the sign hashtag conservative crossroads. Those of you in the audience can likewise do that, and then I will be asking questions from the curated group of questions that we receive when we come to the audience period. So thank you again for coming. Thank you to our distinguished debaters, and without further ado, Mr. Cass argues the proposition.
Thank you, sir. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to Henry and EPPC for putting this together. Rarely am I scrolling through my Twitter feed and see an announcement about a series of events and say like, oh wow, that actually looks really good. And the set that you have put together, I think, captures this crossroads of conservatism perfectly. So I am more excited for the others than this one, frankly, but appreciate all of you being here. And thank you, of course, to AEI as well for hosting. I had a killer Mike Tyson, Jake Paul joke to open with. And then we were sitting in the green room and Scott says, You know, I had a really good Mike Tyson, Jake Paul joke, but then I decided it's kind of lame, so I took it out. And now I am shamed from not using my own. But hopefully this will be more interesting than that was. It's fitting, I think, that this is the first debate because it is, in an important way, a predicate to the others. It is a starting point for understanding what, if any, challenges we have in this nation, and importantly, what, if any, challenges we have for conservatism. Certainly my view is that one of conservatism's major drawbacks or flaws in recent decades has been a refusal to acknowledge the very real challenges that we have in this country. Essentially under the rationale that if we deny anything is wrong, we won't have to admit that we should do anything about it. And that has obviously been politically detrimental to the Republican Party and the conservative movement, and also substantively detrimental to the nation. And so in a sense, I would say the first step is admitting we have a problem, and perhaps I don't know if that makes it the 0th step or the first step is admitting that there might even be a problem. It is notable that we are having this debate because conservatives historically would not, frankly, have been all that interested in this resolution. The standard view has been that absolute consumption level is the measure of well-being, and that individuals as autonomous actors can and will optimize their own outcomes within those constraints. And when I say it that way, you say, like, that sounds like a ridiculous straw man. No one actually believes that. And I do think it's true that no one actually believes that, but I don't think it's a ridiculous straw man. I think what we find over and over again in the debates that we're having with conservatism is we ultimately land back at those two assumptions. And as soon as you loosen one of them and admit that actually, you know, just how much stuff we have probably isn't a very good measure of whether we're flourishing, or you admit that actually individuals are not just autonomous actors unaffected by the conditions around them, and may not be always optimizing for their own maximum well-being, I think most of the rest of the conservative argument that things are going well falls apart. And so what is my view of this? I want to break it down. I admire this resolution. It actually reminded me of in torts class, you have a cause of action, and there are the different elements of it, and you actually have to prove all of them. We have a claim we are talking about public policy in recent decades. We are claiming that it caused economic changes. And then we are looking at the quality of life for most Americans and saying that it had caused them to get worse. We essentially have all of these components of harm, causation, and so forth. And I think also, much as in the case of a tort lawsuit, we have a real problem of finding the truth in a sense. These are not claims that one can simply prove in a scientific way. What I am hoping to demonstrate to you is essentially by the preponderance of the evidence, these things are more likely than not to be true, and that as a result, we as conservatives need to proceed accordingly. So let's start with the philosophical question. What is quality of life? If you haven't watched the Cato Institute's Faces of Globalization video series, I highly recommend it. You will come away far more disgusted by globalization than you went into it. One of the three features a wonderful woman, Jalon Az, who is an online social media influencer and video game streamer, which is one of the wondrous forms of production and consumption that globalization has enabled. And as she says, I can see why people are so confused about this world because it's just totally nonsensical. It's the internet. I'm talking to myself, if you think about it, for hours on end, looking at a camera, but in a sense, it feels like there's people there because they're commenting on everything that's going on. And I think there are two ways we could look at this. We could say, well, she plays a lot of video games and a lot of people pay for things in the app to watch her. I don't know how this works, something like that. So obviously, we have a lot of people maximizing their welfare. Or we could say that's not necessarily correct. That actually any coherent politics and understanding of human flourishing and the common good requires us to make some judgments about what, in fact, quality of life is. And I think, obviously, pluralism is an important element of that, right? It's clearly not the case that we optimize quality of life if we create the exact same thing for everybody. But I also don't think it can be the case that we are optimizing quality of life if we simply disavow any knowledge of the question and say that everybody has a sort of opportunity to go their own way, because of course we do have to make public policy. There are decisions that we have to make collectively, and there are trade-offs that we have to balance as a result. And choosing not to choose, choosing to make the set of trade-offs that we face if we simply refuse to weigh into what is the common good, what is quality of life, is a direction to go with trade-offs of its own, and one that I think ill serves most people. So here's my initial shot at it. This isn't comprehensive at all, but I would say that if we're trying to define quality of life, we might need at least a set of buckets. This is not complete, but it's useful. There's the material living standards, there's health and environment, relationships and community, identity and belonging, and then we could have various measures underneath it. Material living standards, we would want to know about absolute quantity and quality. We would want to know about how much flexibility and choice people have within it. We would want to know what sort of relative status people are achieving and how that affects their enjoyment of their material living standards. We would want to know the variance that people experience. Likewise, health and environment, there are a number of measures, relationship and community, identity and belonging. And I think we could look at each of these and ask, how are we doing? I think there are probably three on which we are doing well. I don't think there's any question that the absolute quantity and quality of stuff that people have has gone up. I think with the exception of the spike in the last few years, it's probably the case that public safety has improved over the window of decades. There's no question that measures of environmental quality have gotten better. But I think on probably every other measure, things have stagnated or worsened. And that is essentially the claim that I want to make. And so then I want to shift to sort of the epistemological question of, well, how would you know? Because of course, not all of these things can be measured in a GDP sort of way. So first of all, we could look at empirical data. I think Charles Murray in Coming Apart takes a very interesting approach, which is to take his two upper class and lower class buckets of folks and look at what things drive their responses to whether or not they're very happy. I should say general kind of happiness research, are you happy questions, I don't think are especially useful, but looking at correlations within them can be very useful. And what he finds is that regardless of economic position, the same set of things drives happiness and leads ultimately to the same happiness if you have them all. And the actual sort of economic well-being in terms of material living standard turns out not to matter nearly as much. And so the ones he identifies are high work satisfaction, marriage, social trust, and weekly worship. And this is supported well by the very famous Harvard study of adult development. It's been following people since the 30s, has expanded to other, not just looking at Harvard students, but a much broader cross-section of society. And this is from Harvard coverage of their work. What it finds is that relationships are what keep people happy, protect people from life's discontents, help to delay mental and physical decline, better predictors of long and happy lives than social class IQ, genes, et cetera. That was the case across everybody they studied. So I think that's probably probative. We do a lot of survey work at American Compass on values and priorities, and I think this is a helpful way of looking at things. Apologies, it's a confusing chart, but we essentially provided different dichotomies. For instance, how much value do you place on consumerism versus productivity on the left side, on rootedness versus mobility on the right side, and ask people where they think America's priorities are today and where you would ideally like to see America's priorities. And so what you see in all the gray dots and all the red dots are massive shifts from perception of where we are today, with a relatively greater focus on consumerism, relatively greater focus on mobility, and a very strong preference for optimizing around things like productivity and rootedness. And what I think you see is when we simply say, well, we're going to just optimize everybody's own choice and ensure that they maximize their welfare accordingly, that works very well if what people want is mobility and consumerism. But if what people want is productivity and rootedness, you are actually depriving them of the ability to achieve that if you say, well, we're simply not going to weigh in on any of these decisions. So how do we interpret trends? One thing I think it's important to say is that if we see shifts in the averages, we should probably assume that everybody has shifted. At least that should be the default. The alternative could be, oh, there's just some chunk of people that moved, and that caused the average to move. But I think there should be a pretty high burden to prove that that happened. And likewise, if we see a really bad tail outcome, things have gotten really worse for some group of people, we should probably assume that that represents an actual shift in what's going on for most people, not that there's some simply very small group that's been uniquely affected, again, unless we have evidence that that's the case. So it seems to me there are a few forms of evidence we could look at. We could just ask people. This is compared to your parents' generation. Do you think in general your opportunities to succeed in life are better than theirs, about the same as theirs, worse than theirs? 25 years ago, it was 72 to 5, better than my parents. Now it is 39-40, worse than my parents. If you ask Americans, and this is actually a survey we did just of GOP voters, but I don't know of any reason it would be different more broadly, has it gotten harder to achieve middle-class security or easier than ever to achieve middle-class security? They say harder by 90 to 10. We can use more objective measures like health data. This is an interesting study the Financial Times did on life expectancy in the US for health-adjusted life expectancy, and what they find is essentially a leveling off and then decline in the US that puts us at roughly the level of the very poorest county in England, and at any given income level, roughly 5 years shorter life expectancy than they have in England. You can ask people what they care about at specific points in life. I think setting off well is an especially important thing we would want to look at. We know our education system does that very poorly. What people want the education system to do overwhelmingly is help students develop the skills and values to build decent lives, not maximize their academic potential and pursue admission to selective colleges. But of course, we've done the latter. And as a result, for every 100 students who enter the 9th grade, 13 don't complete high school, 29 don't enroll in college, another 27 enroll but don't complete, another 13 complete but don't end up in a job requiring a degree. Fewer than 1 in 5 are actually going from high school to college to career. And we then see that show up in actual outcomes for young people in terms of much lower levels of family formation, much lower levels of living independently at all. In fact, people are now more likely to be living at home with their parents than independently with a significant other. And finally, I think we have to look at proxies like this. This is deaths from alcohol use disorders in Russia in the decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is our sort of quintessential illustration of a failed and collapsing society, in a sense. This is drug overdose deaths in the United States on the same scale as a rate. We are now at the same level as the average for the 10 years after the Soviet Union's collapse. And I just don't know how you reconcile that with any claim that, in fact, quality of life for most Americans is getting better. Final point I want to make is about the question of whether economics has anything to do with this. And I think the simple reason and most obvious case that it does is that we've seen entirely divergent outcomes on all of these measures based on your economic standing. Charles Murray's charts, I think, are still the best on this, so I've just dropped a bunch here. But it did not used to be the case that you were far, far more likely to get married or have a happy marriage if you were in the higher income group than the lower income group. Now that is the case. Much more likely to see a drop-off in trustworthiness, in community engagement, if you're in a lower class. Much more likely to not be working or making a living at all if you're in a lower class. And so we could say, well, that's just some weird function of the culture that only affected one set of people, not the other. Or we could recognize that, again, at least as a presumption and on the preponderance of the evidence, something has gone very wrong. The last point I will make, as they wave the stop sign at me, is that this is in fact what we said we were going to do. It's impossible to believe that this is not the result of public policy because, of course, it was the stated goal of public policy to make this set of trade-offs. Glenn Hubbard, George W. Bush's CEA chair, made it very clear, goal of the economic system is producing goods and services as cheaply as possible. Jason Furman, Obama's CEA chair, imports are the good things we enjoy, exports are the unfortunate things we do just so we can get desirable inputs. Stephen Moore, founder Club for Growth, Wall Street Journal editorial board, and so forth. Cheap labor leads to a booming stock market that benefits everyone. Paul Krugman, writing about free trade, just explicitly acknowledging this is going to drive down US wages, both in theory and in fact, and that is going to lead to worse outcomes for particularly less skilled workers. So I don't think we can really say, well, sure, this is happening. Sure, it's because of the economics. Yes, this is essentially what we thought we were doing when we pursued the economic policy we have, but please, let's pretend it's not our fault. Thank you very much.
And now, Scott Winship with the negative.
Great, thank you, Henry. Thanks to EPPC for co-sponsoring and to Henry for organizing the whole series and moderating tonight. Thanks to Oren for coming down here to the Lion's Den. Thanks to everyone for showing up or for being online watching it as well. It's a pleasure to be here tonight on the eve of a new presidential administration, a new congressional session to debate one of the most important questions dividing conservatives today: to fluoridate drinking water or not to fluoridate. I joke, of course. If you don't laugh, you've just got to cry sometimes. So I'm going to maybe come back to the part about the resolution that is about whether the quality of life has improved over time. And I'm going to focus more on the sort of front end of the resolution. Has policy affected the economy in ways that have then hurt the quality of life? And even more specifically, I'm going to focus on what's happened in the economy and to workers over recent decades. Because I think maybe the link that was missing from Oren's opening statement was the quality of life changes that he's pointed out, the disparities that he's pointed out. Did the economy do that to folks? And so maybe we can come back to that. I'm going to argue that the American working and middle classes are richer than ever before and among the very richest in the world. Therefore, the social problems that we've experienced, very real problems from the opioids crisis to family breakdown, to the teen mental health crisis, and the ones that Oren listed in his 4x4 quadrant, those can't be attributed to economic deterioration. If anything, many of our economic and social challenges today are the result of choices Americans have made as we have become more affluent as a nation. And many involve trade-offs with seldom acknowledged benefits. So I want to argue that pursuing populist policies won't address our very real problems, and it distracts us from identifying policies that would be effective for solving these very real problems. More to the point, populism distracts us from creating an agenda to help more disadvantaged children benefit from the singular strength of the American economy. So in his 2018 book, The Once and Future Worker, Oren first outlined his, quote, working hypothesis. Family and community, Oren writes, provide the social structures necessary to a thriving society and growing economy. Those institutions, in turn, rely on a foundation of productive work. I'm going to focus a lot on that phrase. Unfortunately, according to Oren, quote, American public policy has lost its way. Since the middle of the last century, it has chased national economic growth, expecting that the benefits would be widely shared. To the contrary, Oren claims, the typical American has seen only economic stagnation or decline. The result have been a variety of social and economic maladies. So let's test his hypothesis. Let's stipulate right off the bat the fundamental importance of family and community and of a foundation of productive work. Has American public policy failed to secure that foundation? If it hasn't, then we should reject the working hypothesis. We should reject, I'll argue, the American Compass Project, and the idea that policy choices have led to economic harm, leading to the nation's other serious problems. So in evaluating the working hypothesis, it makes sense to start by looking at overall economic growth. Gross domestic product per capita is a measure of the value of the goods and services produced by Americans. We're going to talk a lot about production tonight, and of the income thereby accruing to them. It's higher today than ever before, and about 4 times higher after adjusting for inflation than in, quote, the middle of the last century when Oren says things began to go astray. All the nations that have ever had higher GDP per capita than the US does today are small countries that are either tax havens or sit on vast oil fields. Saudi Arabia is the biggest of these. It's a nation with 1/10 the population of the United States, where women have only been allowed to drive since 2017. So it's an odd group of countries that are richer than us. Most economists disagree with Oren that public policy is focused too much on chasing economic growth. Rather, they believe that one of our central challenges is that economic growth in the US has slowed since the 1960s, and particularly since 2000. But this is a challenge shared by other rich nations. Okay. My first chart just shows that the richest countries in 1990 subsequently experienced the slowest growth rates, while the poorest saw the fastest rates. This pattern seems unlikely to be driven by countries enacting worse policies the richer they become. Dietrich Vollrath has examined the post-2000 slowdown in American growth and attributed it to 2 factors. The first is the rising average age of the population that has occurred because fertility has declined. That's reduced the number of workers relative to retirees, and it's slowed the educational and experiential upgrading of the workforce. The second explanation he gives is the shift of consumer demand from goods to services, which are harder to produce with ever greater efficiency. These trends, common to rich countries around the world, are both reflections of rising affluence. As women's opportunities increase, they and their husbands give up more by having more children. People with greater income want to spend more on relatively expensive services like healthcare. If high economic growth is a prerequisite for a foundation of productive work, the US is nearly unrivaled. However, Oren's working hypothesis presumes that policymakers' focus on growth has been wrong-headed because the typical American has not benefited from it. But Oren is wrong. The American economy has made the typical worker significantly better off over time. The average hourly wage of production and non-supervisory workers, which is just a measure of how the typical worker, how much the typical employee makes, rose by 30% between 1973 and 2023 after taking inflation into account. More to the point, it rose by 40% from the business cycle peak of 1989 to 2023. That's an extra $17,250 a year for a typical worker today working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. To look at wage and income trends, this is going to be some spinach, one needs to account for the fact that prices rise over time. I do so here and below, unless I note otherwise, using the measure of price change preferred by the Federal Reserve Board and the Congressional Budget Office, which is called the PCE Price Index, which also increases similarly to the measure preferred by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In a recent paper, I showed that because of known methodological biases, even these indexes tend to overstate inflation and thereby understate how much incomes have risen over time. For instance, after accounting for these biases, wages rose not 30% over 50 years, but 60%, 60. Oren has repeatedly argued that this typical wage hasn't risen at all, but he uses a different price index, the CPI, that has known deficiencies. The Bureau of Labor Statistics advised against using the CPI to look at long-term income trends back in 1989, and the Census Bureau and Congressional Budget Office followed suit and haven't used it to look at long-term income trends in over 30 years. Here's a concrete example illustrating why I'm taking you this far into the weeds, and I apologize. In a chart ironically titled "Something Looks Wrong," Oren has claimed that wages rose 1% from 1972 to 2022, at the same time that labor productivity rose 141% and corporate profits rose 185%. Here, Oren has used the CPI to adjust wages and profits, but a different price index to adjust productivity. After fixing that and several other issues, consistently looking at aggregate productivity and aggregate pay rather than median pay in the same economic sector rather than different ones, pay rose 106%, not 1%, while productivity rose 118%. It's pretty close to each other. Consistently looking at aggregate profits and aggregate pay per capita for the corporate sector rather than median pay per hour, I find that pay rose 163%, while profits rose 283%. This disparity between profits and pay growth may be illusory. It may be due to the recent but only partial improvement in how the national data measure intangible assets. I'm going to spare you a diversion from a diversion, but let's just agree that 163% growth is different from Oren's 1%, and that something does indeed look wrong in Oren's chart. Okay, now it's true that men's pay did fail to grow for a time. After rising for decades, it was flat between 1973 and 1989, both of those being business cycle peaks. Elsewhere, I've argued that this period represented a historical transition from an era when a lot of men were actually paid in excess of their productivity levels because we had this societal-wide norm that a man should be able to raise a family on one income. As the employment and earnings of married women increased in the 1970s and the 1980s, that norm went away, and men's pay stagnated until their productivity levels caught up. Since 1989, things have looked much better for men. For instance, the annual earnings of the typical full-time year-round male worker rose 16% between that year and 2023, leaving him better off by $9,300. This pattern is a problem from Oren's account because the economic developments he thinks have hurt workers and the harms he blames on these developments, things like increased immigration, rising inequality, the China shock, growing trade deficits, skyrocketing deaths of despair, falling life expectancy, these all happened primarily after the 1980s. The timing is just all off. And by the way, women's earnings rose 33% after 1989 and 55% over 50 years. Now, men's earnings growth has been slower than in the 1950s and 1960s, but getting richer at a slower rate is hardly the same thing as getting poorer. Moreover, it's unlikely that public policy has played a big role in this trend. As we've seen, richer countries have experienced slower economic growth over time around the world. To this generalization, we can add that men have experienced smaller earnings gains than women around the rich world, and smaller gains the richer the country. The next chart looks at the US and 8 of its peer countries in the rich world. We can look at trends across these nations from 1987 to 2019. For each country, there are 2 dots. The darker dots represent men. The lighter dots represent women. All the figures have been adjusted to account not only for increases in the cost of living, but for differences across countries in the cost of living. There are 3 points I want to emphasize from this chart. First, for both men and women, the higher median annual earnings were in 1987, the slower earnings growth was over the next 32 years, hence the downward slope that you see there. Second, in every country, men had higher earnings than women in 1987, and in 8 of the 9 countries, men subsequently saw slower earnings growth than women. Third, men in the US were better off in 1987 than in every other country except for West Germany. Moreover, American men saw slightly faster growth than West Germany did subsequently over the next 32 years. Consequently, in 2019, they were better off than all 8 countries. This fact is notable because American Compass has featured numerous pions to Germany's labor and industrial policy. As an aside, data from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, show that since 1987, Germany's industrial production has risen 47%, while American production has risen 77%. So again, this productive base for families and communities. So the typical middle-class American worker is much better off than in the past, better off than workers in our peer countries. Facts that are true not just of workers generally, but for male workers in particular. These patterns are hard to square with the idea that public policy has kept the American economy from providing an adequate foundation of productive work to support families and communities. Oren's primary attempt to show that Americans have done worse over time involves his cost of thriving index. That index purports to show that, quote, while the typical man working full-time in 1985 could support a family on 40 weeks of income, in 2022, his counterpart, quote, would work the whole year and still come up 10 weeks short. In an analysis with Jeremy Rebuttal, I described a number of problems with this conclusion. Like Saudi Arabia's DMV a decade ago, Oren's analysis ignores women. It focuses on 5 budget items with prices that rose faster than wages, while ignoring nearly half of consumer spending, which happened to go towards items with prices that grew about half as much as paychecks. Among other problems, Oren's approach also fails to account for quality improvement in the goods and services it considers, ignoring the fact that buying something in between the quality of the 1985 items that he priced and the quality of the 2022 items would still leave someone better off over time at less expense. Forget about trying to account for new products that weren't even around in 1984, small things like iPhones and the internet. Jeremy and I showed that it took almost 2 months less work in 2022 to afford budget items equivalent to the 1985 ones that Cass selected. After inflation, weekly after-tax earnings were 53% higher in 2022 than 1985, an increase of $27,400 for full-time employees working 52 weeks. At worst, all the cost of thriving index ultimately showed is that male sole breadwinners are less able to thrive by Oren's definition because as wives' earnings have increased, fewer single earners can match dual earner families. Oren's requirements for thriving in 2022 involve nicer things that 2-earner families are more able to afford than sole earner families. In analyses updating another paper I wrote several years ago, I confirm in every year since 2016, young men have been more able to afford what sole breadwinning young married fathers could buy in 1985. In this sense, men are more marriageable today than at any point in the past 45 years. However, while the typical young man, with or without a partner, had household earnings of $63,300 in 1985 in today's dollars, that had risen to $82,800 by 2023. Therefore, while 25% of men could reach that standard of living without a working wife, today only 20% could. To believe that American public policy has created a problem here, you have to think that it should have prevented the opportunities of married women from expanding. I've shown in another paper from earlier this fall that work has increased at least as much for the wives of the best educated and best earning husbands as it has for other women. The increase in work among wives predates the slowdown in men's wage growth by several decades, rising in tandem with women's educational attainment. The quote problem we hear is not men's ability to support a family, it's that affluence has provided more opportunity to women, increasing inequality between families who wish to get by on one paycheck and families with 2 earners. My analyses, by the way, count men with no earnings at all as falling below the marriageability threshold. The fraction of working age men with no earnings has risen over time. But again, that's a trend that started as far back as the early 1950s, well before the slowdown in men's pay, to say nothing of the China shock. In other work, I've argued that the explanations include falling marriage rates, fewer breadwinner demands and expectations, and more attractive federal disability benefits. Only about 10 to 15% of these non-working men say they are able-bodied and want a job. Falling marriage and increasingly generous disability benefits may be problems, but if so, they are problems of affluent nations. Non-elderly men work less than they used to in our peer nations too, as indicated by OECD data. Don't bother trying to spot the impact of American public policy in this chart. These are, again, those peer countries. I will direct your attention, however, to the green solid line and the green dashed line. The solid line is for West Germany through 1990, and for the dashed line is reunified Germany after that year. They both declined, but most tellingly, the employment rate jumps by 4 percentage points when the much poorer East Germany is added in 1991. Affluence increases incomes, but it also, for better or for worse, reduces work. By the way, female labor force participation rates are at an all-time high in the United States today, and even male rates are higher than at any point since 2009. Other declensionist arguments from Oren are also flawed. He says that despite the redistributive transfers that elites and policymakers have blithely thrown at Americans left behind, poverty has risen over time. But Oren's using a poverty measure here that relies again on that deficient price index, and it ignores benefits from our largest anti-poverty programs. All serious analysts agree that poverty has steadily declined over the years. Moreover, estimates from Columbia University's Center on Poverty and Social Policy show that among the non-elderly population, even before you take any government benefits into account at all, poverty is at an all-time low. Oren says that fewer than half Americans have incomes higher than their parents did at the same age, citing Opportunity Insights. I recently reanalyzed the data that they provide, extending the results 10 years, adjusting the income for inflation using my bias-corrected index, and adjusting for the smaller size of families over time. For 30-year-olds in 2024, 72% are better off than their parents were at the same age. That's down substantially over the years, but it's up from 64% in 2014. For those skeptical of my reanalysis, taking it on faith, I also recently looked at polling questions going back to 1978, asking Americans if they are better off financially than their parents were at the same age. For 68 of the 73 estimates I found, better off won out by a 2-to-1 margin over worse off, and none of the estimates were as low as 50%. And that long-term decline in absolute mobility, it's largely a function of slower economic growth, as my previous analyses of the Opportunity Insights data has shown. If inequality doesn't fall, then to maintain very high absolute mobility rates, you need to maintain high growth rates as well. As we've seen, that hasn't happened in rich countries, so absolute mobility has declined, again, not just in the United States, but in our richer peer countries around the world too. So focusing more on economic growth, not less, is the way to get this rate higher. Finally, it's also important to not reify absolute mobility. The highest absolute mobility rates occurred for children born into the Depression. I don't think we'd want to trade place with those folks. Moreover, the decline in absolute mobility was less severe for Americans who grew up poor. It's easier to exceed your parents' low income than to exceed high parental income. Presumably, it's more important to people that their income is high rather than it just be higher than their parents. Okay, so in closing, I don't want to convey that all is perfect in the United States at all. Economically, we're doing very well, but we could be doing better still if we could increase productivity growth and if we could reverse the decline in male labor force participation over the long run. Economic growth has been uneven across parts of the United States. For instance, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance's hometown of Middletown, Ohio, has seen no household income growth in 45 years. Moreover, reducing the cost of living would benefit Americans across the country. I have ideas for these that I hope we can discuss later on. There are also things the government could do at the margin or stop doing to address social problems like family instability and the withering of civil society. With my colleague Kevin Corinth, I'm editing a policy handbook for release this winter that will address these economic and social issues. I will say for now that my ideas mostly differ from Oren's and mostly call for less interventions in free markets rather than more. Above all, rather than conservatism shifting to a greater focus on protectionism and central planning, I would like to see it more focused on investing in poor kids so that more of them can benefit from the incredible dynamo that is the American economy. That's the focus of a volume I recently edited with Yuval Levin and Ryan Streeter, Doing Right by Kids. The economic claims of declensionists are perhaps not as outlandish as conspiracies about the water supply, but public health and economic policies alike must resist misinformed and counterproductive populism. Thank you.
And now, in good debate style, we have rebuttals. Oren Cass will start first, and then Scott will have the last word. Questions, please send to abigail.wallen, W-A-L-L-E-N, @aei.org.
Make sure we have a good American Compass logo up there while I'm talking. I'm not usually speechless in any context, but I've been struggling a little bit to figure out how to approach this 10 minutes. That presentation wasn't on the topic of this debate. We had a wonderful debate a little over a year ago on the cost of thriving index and what has happened to wages and the ability of a worker to support a family. I highly recommend it. The Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times both concluded cost of thriving index is a valuable way of looking at things that makes an important point. But I don't have any interest in relitigating that here. The question we're talking about today is quality of life and what has happened to it and why. And I don't want to do this in a sort of formal who left which arguments out sort of way. I hope we can talk more about the quality of life question. But as far as I can tell, Scott didn't offer any defense of quality of life. It seemed, as far as I know, we are in agreement that quality of life for most Americans has declined. So I hope we can get into that further, but I don't have anything more to say about that besides the fact that apparently it has. And what we seem to be arguing about is why. And there are two steps to this. One, is it economically driven? And two, then what role does public policy play? On the question of whether or not it's economically driven, I think it's very important to look at essentially the two stories that I gather we are trying to tell. My version of events that I present to you all as the jury is essentially that we see very clearly in the evidence, in every measure that we might look at, that the lower your education level, the worse your labor market prospects in recent decades, the worse your outcomes have been on every measure you might want to consider, right? And on the flip side, I hear Scott saying this is somehow a kind of curse of affluence. I almost find that a little bit of offensive. Like, you know who's really affluent? Hey guys, who in this room's quality of life has gotten worse? Who in this room is suffering the curse of affluence that has worsened their quality of life? Are opioid deaths highest among the richest Americans because it's a curse of affluence? It's a facially absurd explanation that fails to grapple with the reality that what we are seeing is a set of outcomes tied directly to the economic experiences of people in this country. If you wanted, frankly, to make a better argument than the affluence argument, you would say that it was culture, right? This is the conservative standby. It's a culture problem. And I think it's increasingly difficult to make that case for two reasons. First of all, because we see that divergence. So you'd have to start by telling the story there are two different cultures here that have somehow gone in different directions. Now, you'd have to throw out the affluence thing because the most affluent people seem to have no problem with the culture. Again, I'm trying to piece this together as we go. But I guess what you would say is, well, people who have been on the short end of the economic stick, coincidentally, unrelated to the economic forces they are facing, suffered a set of unique cultural challenges. Not because of the actual thing that distinguishes them from the people that aren't suffering the cultural challenges. I will invite Scott to elaborate either that or the affluence explanation. I think they're both quite interesting, I suppose, but I have trouble making sense of either one. And if you accept, therefore, that there clearly have been significant economic changes that have occurred in recent decades, I don't think anyone disputes there have been economic changes, as the resolution says, that those economic changes have affected the affluent and everyone else very differently, and that a consequence of that has been this decline of quality of life for most Americans, then we are most of the way through our resolution. And the last piece we're left with is the public policy piece. What role, if any, did public policy play in these economic changes? For one thing, I should say I don't find the let's look at all of the rest of the developed Western world that pursued the exact same set of economic policies as especially persuasive. I did think it was interesting that in the chart of West Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. labor force declines, male participation rate declines twice as fast as the German one. I would have presented the data a little differently if I'd wanted to really see what was going on. But it seems to me incontrovertible, and again, not disputed by the people who were in charge of these policies, that this was going to be the effect of these policies. Globalization creates winners and losers. Not a controversial statement. Now, there is a claim that over time, the losers, either we compensate them or they adjust and catch up. One of the wonderful things I very much recommend in the Cato Institute's videos on this is they highlight the wonders of globalization in a town decimated by NAFTA. Wiped out. But only 20 years later, thanks to the arrival of a different factory, things started to turn around. And we meet a wonderful worker at this factory whose own childhood was horrible in the aftermath of NAFTA, but she now has an opportunity. And I'm glad that that happened. But there isn't really much dispute at this point that the first order effect in these communities on those who are less affluent has been significant. The best economic research from David Autor on the matter shows, in fact, a direct connection between deindustrialization and not just things like deaths of despair, but also lower marriage rates. And so again, I don't dispute Scott's data that we did globalization and GDP per capita rose. I thought we were done doing the look how high aggregate GDP thing is on the right of center a few years ago, but I guess we're not. But that's not a rebuttal to the concern. The same goes for very high levels of immigration. Even the Cato Institute's analysis of immigration will say, overall, high levels of immigration can be good for the economy, but it's not going to be balanced across everybody. If you let in large numbers of unskilled immigrants, that is not going to have a positive effect on the prospects of the lower wage workers already in your country. We've done that now for 50 years. And finally, I think the education policy itself has to be in focus. We converted our entire education system from one that aimed to serve all young people, and in fact, to some extent, focused on those who were not going to be affluent, and we changed it to one for the people in this room. And maybe you don't want to admit it to yourself, but at some point I do think we all have to admit that the effect of that on everybody else was not that they were too affluent, and that's why things went downhill. It was that we created a two-tiered system. We said, if you're somebody who has the skills and the interest in performing well academically, going on to college, completing college, going on to the kind of job that our wonderful globalized economy is making available, and that is roughly 1 in 5 young people, then things are going to work out very well. If you are not that, we have literally nothing for you. I mean, I use the word literally advisedly here, not as a too-online comment. Think about the difference between an 18-year-old completing high school, who is going on to college, and one who isn't. Think about what we do for the one going to college and how we set them up for success in life in this economy that we've built versus what we do for everybody else. It's a disgrace. And then when we come back and look at what happened as a result and find in one group wonderful data, and if we aggregate it, we can make it look wonderful everybody, and then we look in the other group and we find on every single indicator decline, so much that we're not even having a debate about whether or not quality of life has declined for most people. And then we say, well, the real cause is too much affluence. It's a dead end for the conservative movement. Politically, it's a dead end for the nation substantively, and I am very glad to see it going out of style. Thank you.
And Scott has 5 minutes to make the last word, and last call for questions, abigail.wallen@aei.org.
Okay, so with the time I've got, first let me clarify a couple things. So I didn't argue that the quality of life has not gone down, although I do think it's a little bit more complicated than what Oren has laid out, which I'll come back to in a second. And I also didn't mean to suggest that affluence is primarily behind social problems like deaths of despair, for instance, the opioids crisis in particular. I don't think, well, I can come back to whether affluence relates to the teen mental health crisis, for instance. What I did want to argue is that there hasn't been economic deterioration, and therefore whatever you think has happened to the quality of life in the United States, it's probably not due to economic change. And the resolution, after all, is about whether policy has affected the economy, which has then hurt quality of life for most Americans. So my opening remarks were intended to push back on the economy as being the culprit in terms of whatever you feel about the changes in the quality of life that have happened over time. And then I guess, I think Oren and I have in common that we're both very concerned about disparities. And so I agree that just because aggregate changes look good doesn't mean change has been good for everybody. However, I did try to show consistently what's happened to middle class workers. I showed a poverty rate and what's happened to that, even before you take redistribution into account. So I maintain that economically the story is still much better than we think, all the way up and down the income distribution for folks. Now that doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about the disparities that Oren showed from coming apart that have to do with connection, with loneliness, with happiness, with family stability. These are all things that I'm very concerned about. When I worked for Senator Mike Lee before coming to AEI, we had a whole project about the deterioration of social capital. And contrary, unlike the economic story that I told, which I'll defend up and down, has been like pretty amazing. The social story in the United States and in other rich countries has been up and down in one direction, which is worrisome. So we have a real problem there. But if we try to address that problem through policies like tariffs or industrial policy or regulating the banks, policies that American Compass has really been pushing the last few years, and the National Conservatives in general have been pushing. I got news for you. Like, because the diagnosis of what caused these problems is way off the mark, pursuing these things is not going to solve the problems that we're both concerned about. And they may make the economic challenges worse in the process. So that's the part of the resolution that I've been arguing and focusing on. Quality of life. So it's interesting. There's a big difference between if you ask people about the next generation writ large, about people generally, versus if you ask them about their own kids, if you ask them about their own family, and you get these really remarkably different results. For instance, there was a January Gallup poll that asked, in general, are you satisfied with the way things are going in the United States at this time? And only 20% of the population said that they were satisfied. Now, they asked a separate group the same question, except they swapped out in your personal life. Are you satisfied with how things are going in your personal life instead of in the United States? Anybody want to guess how many people said that they're satisfied with how things are going in their own life? 78%. That was this past January. And that has not gone down over time. That question has been asked over time, going back decades. The other interesting thing that we have to deal with when we look at public opinion is that, like everything else, public opinion surveying has become infected by polarization. And so you get these huge changes on a dime when the president in power changes office between what Democrats think of the economy and of their prospects of people in general, and what Republicans think. And so in that January Gallup poll, there was a 5 percentage point difference in how Democrats and Republicans assessed their personal lives. There was a 25-point gap in terms of how they assess the United States. And if they do it next January, you're going to see it flip. Republicans are going to think things are hunky-dory, and Democrats will be saying how terrible the economy is. One last thing. So contrary to popular belief, most Americans are actually satisfied with their own personal lives on a variety of dimensions. So Gallup in January of 2023 found that 90% of people were satisfied with their family life, 88% with their housing, 87% with their education, 87% with their work, 84% with their community, 81% with their health, 77% with their leisure time, 76% with their standard of living, and 71% with their household income. That's been asked, the standard of living question has been asked going back to 1963. There's basically no trend. It's where it's always been. So I think it does us no good, even if we're worried about certain aspects of the quality of life, as I am, the disparities that exist. It doesn't do us any good to paint this as being a more widespread deeper problem than it is, or else we won't be able to properly prioritize the folks who do need policy solutions. Thanks.
Well, now we're going to have a few minutes where the debaters can question each other. I'm going to give, since Scott just spoke, I'm going to give Oren the first question, then I'm going to give Scott a question. We'll go on for a few minutes, and then we'll turn to the audience. So, Oren, what would you like to ask Scott?
I'm genuinely curious what you think of the second part of the question. Do you think the quality of life for most Americans has gotten better, worse, or stayed the same?
I think the social quality of life, it has the sort of non-material aspects of our lives in general have deteriorated pretty rapidly. So I would break it into sort of a series of longer-term 50-year declines in things like marital stability, the decline of the two-parent family, the share of kids living with two parents. But that's just one aspect of a much broader deterioration of our social capital. You can look at how much people participate in civil society. That's gone down over time. Church attendance has gone down over time. You can there are measures of how much time people spend doing things cooperatively with their neighbors informally. That's gone down over time. People doing things with their coworkers after work socially has gone down over time. Trust in institutions in the United States, from media to government to corporations to labor unions, all of that has gone down over time as well. I would add to that residential segregation by class has increased, so people are much less likely to live in economically diverse neighborhoods, actually a little bit more likely to live in racially diverse neighborhoods. So on a whole swath of measures, I think our lives have gotten a lot worse. Now, a lot of that, I think, is due to rising affluence. I think when people are rich enough that they can afford to rely on the market for things like childcare, when you don't need your neighbors to raise a barn, when there are insurance products that you can buy on the commercial market rather than having to count on your friends and family. That all contributes to people relying less on each other. I think, as big a champion as I am, I have a 14-year-old daughter, of like the greater opportunities that women have in the United States. The fact that we send more, we have more two-worker families today than we did in the past has had real consequences. You can think of, the sort of Leave It to Beaver era as not just a period where women were homemakers, but they were community makers. And when they worked more, men did not lean out and say, hey, now's my chance to invest in my community and work less. And so what you got instead was a time crunch. People that have more stuff, that chose to buy more stuff, that chose to have fewer kids, but are now sort of feeling a time crunch because there's not enough time to do things that there used to be a lot more time for. More recently, I think the teen mental health crisis is just a huge challenge. I would say that also relates to affluence in the sense that I think smartphones are a big part of that. I don't think that's a policy choice necessarily that was made, although I do think that it's probably time that policy start thinking about whether there are ways to help parents help their kids not be on their phones so much, and to get back out in the world, have unsupervised play and things like that. So yeah, I think in many ways the quality of life is lousy. I would like to see policy do something about it. I think people go to the economic explanation because we kind of think we know what to do about economic problems, right? Whether you think it's tariffs or whether you think it's raising taxes or cutting welfare benefits or whatever your perspective is, we kind of have ideas about what to do about economic problems. We don't have a lot of great ideas about what to do about social problems, and so people don't like to think about that. But I think if the next administration prioritizes that and puts it above, frankly, things like trade, anti-trade policies, tariffs, industrialization, kind of the big things that that the sort of populist right is talking about, that would be amazing. So that would be my position there.
Can I ask a brief follow-up? He can have a
Brief,
follow-up.
but then
Brief
give
follow-up.
Scott the same opportunity.
Would you apply that assessment to the high-income educated professional, such as you or me, or do you think our quality of life is worse than it would have been 40 years ago?
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think it is cultural change in a lot of ways that in some aspects relates to economic change, but in some aspects doesn't. And so I think we can walk and chew gum in thinking that there are these cultural changes that have been bad for everybody, even as we can also say, well, they've hurt some people a lot more than they've hurt a lot of other folks. And I think, I'm much more concerned about the social capital declines that have happened among lower income Americans than I am about folks like us, who empirically the declines haven't been quite as bad, but there have been declines.
Scott, what would you like to ask Oren?
So I guess sticking with my my sort of focus on whether jobs are providing a foundation of productive work to support family and community life, I guess this was kind of one of the things that I always thought, even in the once and future worker, there was a little bit of an underpants gnome part of the argument for those who have seen South Park. If you haven't seen South Park, that makes zero sense. But essentially, there was this.
I've seen South Park, so we're doing okay.
So there's this discovery that that at night the underpants gnomes were stealing one of the kids' underwear, and they caught them in the act. And then the gnomes explained, like, step 1, collect underwear. Step 2, question mark. Step 3, profit. And so it was like the question mark was never filled in. And so for me, that was a part that I felt was lacking from the once and future worker.
So how to profit on the underpants.
Right. Tell me how you profit with the underpants. No. So if we were to have some kind of jobs that we don't have today, that would be more supportive of family community life, what would those jobs look like that they don't look like today? How would they inspire people to start volunteering in their communities again? How would they revive marriage as an institution? How would they increase fertility? How would some of these social issues that we're concerned about change as a result of there being somehow a different distribution of jobs than what we've got?
Sure. I guess actually a good way to answer this to start with is, it's funny, we've found the issue on which you are declensionist and I am not. I would say quality of life for highly educated professionals has undoubtedly improved over 40 years ago. And the fundamental reason for that, and maybe it's a way in which I'm too free market, is I think that if you are, if things are all going well for you, you really do have a significant amount of choice in how to organize your life. I think that where you see a family with two highly educated professionals that are both working, they are in fact both choosing to work, and they can afford to do that. And if they wanted to choose otherwise, they could afford to do that also. I think what has happened that is very different further down the income ladder is that essentially that choice has been taken away to a significant extent. And I think on the descriptive nature of that, I don't know that we even disagree that much, that essentially to participate fully with middle-class security in modern American life, to some extent, you do need two incomes of moderate or lower, which means that whereas historically there is a world in which a single income did deliver middle-class security, and you therefore, if you were having a second parent work or a second adult work in the family, that was a choice. You had that flexibility in how you wanted to arrange your time. To a significant extent, that has gone away. And this is something that we find when we do survey and focus group work also, is that definition of one income being sufficient to support a family is something that people focus on heavily. When we ask people what do they define as the key elements of middle-class security, after reliable healthcare, that was the top one. And I think that makes sense. And conversely, if you ask people how do they feel about the sort of descriptive situation that Scott and I agree on, that at this point, achieving a lot of these things requires having two parents in the workforce. You do have the option to only have one, but there's obviously some fairly severe trade-offs in a lot of cases at this point. They say that's not a successful kind of economy. That's a major problem. And so to me, when we're thinking about what has happened in the economy, a huge part of the explanation has to be, relatively speaking, what has happened to the typical or median job as compared to what has happened to the sort of upper middle class level of affluence that tends to define our social norms. And I think one place where your research, again, we agree entirely on the data, but I take issue, for once it's me taking issue with your methodology, is in looking at what has happened to productivity growth versus wages and flipping from median wage to aggregate income. Because I totally agree with you, productivity growth has tracked aggregate income fairly well. I think conversely what that tells us, especially if we believe the labor market is functioning at all, is that most of the productivity growth has been among the higher income segments of the workforce. And that has therefore created a situation where the typical job for the less educated lower income worker has simply failed to keep up with what is needed to deliver middle class security. And I think that's a substantive problem for families. I also think it's a huge political problem for the nation, because the promise of capitalism broadly, and certainly how conservatives want to sell it to the American people, is that in fact the rising tide does lift all boats. And the thing that is going to produce that growth, that is going to deliver all of these gains, is going to be widely shared. And I think if we then come back and say, okay, well, not really, but you're not any worse off than you used to be, so what are you complaining about? I would, I don't think that is just, and I certainly don't think it works. And so this is a long preamble to give my answer, which is that I would like to see an economy where ultimately we never had that divergence in productivity growth to begin with, and conversely that we now need to find a way to reconverge it. And I think that much tighter labor markets, particularly at the low end, incentives to actually find ways to invest in and make American workers more productive, rather than what we have been doing, which is the opposite, has to be a starting point for how those kinds of jobs become more typical.
Scott, do you have a follow-up?
Just a quick follow-up related to sole earner couples. So I think you guys did a survey in 2021 where you asked about people's work situations, and of the people with less than a bachelor's degree, so we're not talking about maybe the folks that we work with every day, 60% of them had one full-time worker and one non-worker. These are parents with young kids. And 20% of them had two full-time workers. So I guess you're saying those numbers should be higher? Is that sort of?
Which numbers should be higher?
So if 60% of married parents of young kids are actually using the sole breadwinner model, that could suggest that we're actually doing a pretty good job there too, in terms of what people say is most important to them, in terms of what a good job is.
I would have to go back and look at the specific data. My guess is that you're looking at something that was broken out by class in the different answers.
It's less than bachelor's folks.
It's the less than bachelor's folks.
Yep.
I think the way that we would look at it, or that I would look at, is to want to essentially cross-cut that, and this is why we usually use class, which is combined education and income, to understand what are the income levels in those households. I think another place where we entirely agree is on a lot of the destructive ways in which the safety net operates today. One thing that we found is that at this point, if you ask people about sort of material hardship and risk, you get the exact same answer for everybody with incomes 0 to 20, 20 to 40, and 40 to 60, which means that in one sense you could say it's wonderful we've lifted up the 0 to 20s, but from another perspective we've wiped out the distinctions between a full-time earner and essentially a welfare-dependent family. And so, I would want to know what the incomes of those families are, but ideally I would want us to be able to say families in that position are achieving the core elements of middle class security, and that's what I think we're probably lacking.
Okay, well, we're going to go to some audience questions, and I'll try and get through as many of the questions as we have time for. First question for Scott, and I'll just go back and forth.
I think it's only for Scott. I mean,
I'm sorry?
I was just saying,
Okay, you want me to ask them all of Scott?
whatever you've got.
Scott, do you think the declines in many communities and major economic changes like the China shock are coincidental?
Yeah, I don't think they relate much to each other. I think that the Otter paper, so for folks who are not terminally nerdy like some of us.
There's no one in this room that's not familiar with the Otter paper.
I'm not going to make you raise your hands. David Otter is an MIT economist. He wrote the paper that I think probably coined the term China shock. And it's an important paper, and he finds that communities that were particularly exposed to trade with China, just by virtue of the manufacturing that took place within them, experienced a lot of joblessness that then created a number of other problems, including declines in marriage, I think. I'm forgetting some of the other outcomes, but a number of outcomes. Now, you know, this is a paper that is capturing the costs of increasing trade with China, right? Of letting China into the World Trade Organization. I don't think there are any economists that would say there are absolutely no losers to any policy. And certainly, like, increasing trade with China has created folks who are worse off as a result. And that's mainly been people who lost their jobs because the factory closed or whatever. It's not capturing any of the benefits, which are very broadly distributed among consumers who face lower prices by virtue of imports. Research has shown there are a number of firms even that were exposed to increased trade with China that actually increased their employment, the number of workers that they had. Why? Well, one reason is because half of imports are actually inputs to production, right? And so if your inputs to production are cheaper, you can hire more workers as well. So the Otter paper, the risk of it is to sort of look at it and say, like, you know, unambiguously, the main outcome of increasing trade with China was that everybody lost their jobs and there was no upside. There were big upsides. More than that, though, just the timing doesn't really work out. I mean, pick a problem. The opioids crisis, which really, when we're talking deaths of despair, I mean, the opioids crisis is 80% of that. The timing of that coincides with I've forgotten the name of the pharmaceutical company that got sued. Purdue coming out with new drugs to treat pain, which you know, my colleague Sally Satel, I think, would argue that we probably went a bit too far worrying about opioids, or not worrying about them, but sort of eviscerating doctors who are prescribing opioids. Opioids have actually done a fair amount of good as well, and they're highly addictive, and they created huge problems for lots and lots of people. It continues today. But that doesn't start with the China shock. That starts in the 1990s. If you look at the teen mental health crisis, God bless Jean Twenge, she'll tell you that it all started like the day the iPhone came out. You know, everything got worse, which I think is an overstated case. But she doesn't claim, and nobody claims, I think, that in 2001, when China entered the World Trade Organization, that suddenly teen mental health went up. There are people who make incredibly unpersuasive cases that the Great Recession was the source of the teen mental health crisis. I don't think there's any evidence for that at all. What else? You know, the decline of the family, you know, that goes back to the 1960s. All these other long-term social capital declines start way before the China shock. They start way before the first trade deficit in 1978. So I think there's just not much of a case at all that you can blame our most worrisome problems today on trade or the China shock.
Oren, you argue that there aren't opportunities in America for men without a college degree, but blue-collar employers are starving for more welders, construction workers, et cetera. There's a massive labor shortage for blue-collar workers. What is wrong with this picture in your mind?
Well, I think there are a couple of problems. One is that we have a fundamental mismatch between what those jobs are and what we are actually preparing people to do. And this goes to the education point in particular, that we essentially have a system that pushes everybody away from exactly those kinds of pathways and then makes it very difficult to connect people into them. I think what you'll also find on the employer side, because of course you could say to an employer, well, there are also a lot of young men out there, why is there a labor shortage? Is that we have obviously fundamentally broken something here. There's a real problem, I think, with spending several decades essentially ignoring the fates of these folks, allowing these communities to collapse for, I guess, entirely coincidental reasons, and then turning around and saying, well, I don't understand what happened to our labor force. So I do think there's significant opportunity there, and it's an area where there's huge opportunity for policy reform. I do think it's also important to keep in mind that that is very attractive at the margin, but is going to address a very small share of the problem. That is, there are absolutely a lot of good jobs available there. There are not a lot of jobs there relative to the overall labor force and the number of low quality jobs that we need to find a way to upskill in and make more productive in various respects. So, before looking at who are the people on the sidelines who don't want the jobs, it's actually, I think, more interesting to look at the folks who are they are working, they're just in lower paid work, right? Why are there so many people working in service jobs at significantly lower wages than welding would pay? Why aren't they all going and filling the welding and plumbing jobs? And so then you can't even pick a cultural explanation around, decline in workforce participation or whatever else. You simply have a fundamentally broken labor market that does not equip people with skills to succeed in these kinds of roles, again, entirely in the non-college world where we've just failed to give it any attention at all.
Scott, with respect to quality of life, how do you square your assertions with widespread negative voter and worker sentiment throughout the country to the contrary? Are their experiences of quality of life dissatisfaction and desire for public policy to actively address their dissatisfaction less relevant than the data and survey responses you presented?
It's a great question. So I guess my first answer is that I think there's pretty widespread, in some quarters, misunderstanding about what is driving conservative populism. I think when Donald Trump came onto the scene in 2015, when he won in 2016, a lot of people were trying to figure out, what just happened? What are these folks looking for? Henry and I were part of a now memory hold group of conservatives called the Reformicons that thought we knew what the voters were demanding, and we turned out to be completely wrong. So there was this effort to try to figure out what everybody was looking for. A lot of these debates turned on whether it was economics. Is it trade in communities that have been hit by trade? Is it immigration? Because people are concerned about their jobs, or is it cultural concerns? It's concern about the character of America and waves of immigration making some people uncomfortable with the culture changing. Is it people being fed up with sort of progressive dominated institutions that are condescending towards much of the country? whether that's academia or media, the sort of woke tech. Is that what's driving all of this? And it's kind of hard to disentangle a lot of that stuff, because if you do things like look at the educational attainment or income of the parts of the country where he's done well or has improved his margins, it's downscale folks economically. Does that mean it's because they're lower income or that their incomes haven't increased as much? Or is it because they're working class Americans with a completely different culture and a completely different take on social conservatism, for instance, than what progressive elites are spouting? And so, to my mind, I think the sort of cultural explanation is more persuasive. I don't have nearly the research to sit here and rattle off, except that there were a lot of surveys that were done after 2016 about sort of why Trump voters, what their main concerns were, why they had voted for Trump. I think after January 6th, it's very hard for me to understand how people still think that the main resentments of Trump's strongest voters are economic. I just don't see how folks came to Washington, D.C. and went from the ellipse to the Capitol building because their child tax credit should have been bigger, or that just doesn't seem right to me. Clearly, those folks are not representative of the entire Trump coalition, I will state, just in case anybody wants to try to misconstrue me. So I think part of my answer is that the economic concerns are actually probably less salient than a lot of folks think. Now, that said, I think any of the polls that dug into why the economy was a top choice for folks coming out of the exit polls, for instance, any of them that sort of specifically honed in on inflation, that seems, Henry will correct me, Henry should correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that inflation was really the thing that people were frustrated with. Even there, I'd argue, wage growth has been, inflation-adjusted wage growth has been quite strong since 2019. It's been the strongest among the bottom fifth of earners. Their wages have grown 13% since 2019, I think. But there is this asymmetric perception that you go to the grocery store, you clearly see prices are higher. You go to the gas pump, you don't necessarily register that, oh, your cost of living adjustment at the end of the year was also higher than it would have been too. I'm sort of not directly answering the question, I guess. Part of it, I think, is that people do have these asymmetries about what they see in the world in terms of inflation. I think if you look at the polling data, contrary to the things I showed you about how people feel about their own lives, people are very pessimistic about the state of the country. If you ask them, how are people out there doing generally, even if they think their own family is doing well, they'll tell you like the rest of the country is doing terribly. And that's a function of, what they see in the media, what they hear from think tanks, what members of Congress tell them. And people are much less informed about what is further away from them than what is near and immediate to them. So I do think that is part of the explanation as well, that people don't realize that if you aggregate the individual views of everybody, you get a lot more optimism about the state of the world than if you just guess about what those aggregated views look like.
All right, time for the last question. Oren, what is your response to Scott's argument that the real wages adjusted for inflation have improved substantially over the past few decades?
Oh, do I have a response to that? I think there are two issues. One is the question of for who. And one of the places where Scott and I agree, and I actually quote Scott frequently on this point, is that even using Scott's metrics, that is not the case for young men. I think it's particularly 25 to 29-year-old men who have sort of flat, even down over a 50-year period. And so, I do think when we're assessing kind of what is going on in the society, What does it mean for the trajectory of people's lives? What does it mean for family formation? That is a particularly salient problem. Beyond that, I think it's very important to recognize that, real wages as measured that way measure something that is important to know, which is essentially how much stuff can you buy. And I think that's a very useful data point, and that's why, on my list of all the things we might consider on quality of life, absolute quantity and quality of stuff was lit up as better for everybody. Probably not better for everybody on the basis of market income, but probably better for almost everybody at every strata once you take transfers into account. The problem is that is not all that goes into the well-being of a family, household, even an individual. I think, my favorite example of this is to just think about like televisions. And it's absolutely true that the television you can buy today compared to the television you could buy in 1980 is like completely night and day, right? And economists would rightly therefore value that as a massive real gain for people. The problem with that is twofold. One, how much of a gain is it? In that I don't think people actually enjoy being a football fan any more than they did in 1980. And two, if you said, well, okay, but I still want to buy the 1980 television, first of all, you literally can't. And even if you tried to, now you would be the guy with the weird, crappy television who no one wants to go over to their house to watch the game. And so, that's kind of a very little pedantic example, but it gets at something very real when you're thinking about everything we consume, which is that as a society's standard of living rises, people have to keep up with that essentially to be as well off as they were. And if we have a divergence that leaves a lot of people falling behind in relative terms, then there are very meaningful ways that has affected their quality of life for the worse.
Well, whichever side you come down on this debate, I think you can agree that we have been educated and informed by civil and intelligent debaters, and I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Scott and Oren.
Thank you.